Okay, so we're actually going to just talk about World War II today and how war production came about during the Second World War. I do have some visuals, so at some point I will flip around my laptop. You can squint at it and then you can afterwards come up and look more. But some of the descriptions of boats will make more sense if you can see the boats, and they're too big for me to drag one with me, and I don't even have any of them. So we'll get started. So when you think about war production during World War II, what do you picture? Do we picture the plant at Willow Run in Detroit and we see all of the beautiful planes lined up? Do you think tanks? Well, with the Maritime Museum, I want to challenge you to think about maritime war production, so not tanks, not planes necessarily. Or maybe you think of companies who completely switched their factories over from civilian products like typewriters or corsetry to rifles and grenade belts. But our local industries, we already had a strong boat building industry in the area, and a lot of our focus today is going to be what the contributions were by Lyman and Matthews. So before we can talk about war production, let's talk about defense production. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler's Nazi forces, 1.5 million soldiers, 2,000 airplanes, 2,500 tanks invade Poland, kicking off World War II in Europe. England and France then immediately declare war on Germany and realize that it will not be a quick battle. In fact, the Sandusky Register reported in mid-September 1939 that the British government says war will last at least 3 years. Now we realize now with hindsight that that was maybe some rose-colored glasses, since it lasted longer than that. At this point, nearly 80% of Americans were against our involvement in the war, because of the memories from World War I. We had already lived through the Great War that was supposed to be one and done. It was the greatest war to ever happen. It was not supposed to turn into World War I of two. So how did we get from that point to what we were at the end of the war? In the 1930s, there had been a succession of neutrality acts that were passed. These cemented the isolationism of the United States, and they actually outlawed arms sales or loans to nations at war, including civil war. So Spain and the Spanish Civil War also fell under that. By mid-September of 1939, however, more than 60% of Americans had changed their minds slightly, and they supported arms sales to allies on a cash and carry basis. This could be the economic boost needed after a decade of the Depression. Republican Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan said, "I frankly question whether we can become an arsenal for one belligerent without becoming the target for another." So there was public support and public opposition to both of these. A repeal of the arms ban was approved in October of 1939 as Europe entered the Phony War. Is everybody familiar with the Phony War? Couple of you? All right. So the Phony War is the period from September of 1939 until June of 1940, in which nothing really happened in Europe. Everybody said, "All right, I declare war," and then didn't do anything, except Poland, but as we proved several times throughout history, nobody really cares about Poland. So England and France have declared war, and they're just using this time to build up their militaries. And it wasn't until the fall of France in June of 1940 and the miracle of Dunkirk that we finally said, oh, hey, we actually need to do something and maybe start doing something a little more effective, because we just lost France. Britain is now getting attacked and bombed very frequently. This is becoming more real. So because of the fall of France, quote, "the condition of American defenses became the most vital topic in the nation. After months of inaction, in the space of a few weeks, Congress approved over $3 billion in additional military appropriations, and that was $3 billion in 1940 dollars, not today. More than had ever been cumulatively spent in American history up to that point on war or defense costs. And its equivalency today would be about $58 billion. Though defense production would remain relatively sluggish throughout 1940, enough jobs were created to reduce unemployment to 8 million by the end of the year. So we'd had a decade of the biggest unemployment crisis the nation had ever faced, and then we finally dropped it because we were selling supplies and guns to other countries. In January of 1941, Roosevelt established the Office of Production Management, OPM, to centralize direction of federal procurement programs and quasi-war production. So quasi-war production is production taking place prior to the formal declaration of war. Under the executive order establishing the OPM, The Armed Services and the War Department declared all contracts above $500,000 with the OPM's Division of Purchases. OPM also spread government procurement contracts as widely as possible to alleviate the hardships of small businesses whose peacetime lines of production had been either curtailed or prohibited. The Armed Services promoted subcontracting of government procurement by primary contractors, mostly large manufacturers, to small businesses. For this purpose, the OPM created the Defense Contract Service in February of 1941 and established field offices in the Federal Reserve banks. The perceived interference by civilian officers of the OPM in military procurement elicited frequent protests from the military. They did not like civilians telling them what they had to buy and how they were going to get it. William Knudsen, who had worked for both the Ford and GM, was the chair of the OPM, and he became the first dollar-a-year man. And he was called that because Roosevelt had this bevy of men under his command who had made enough money on their own that they did not need to receive payment from the government. So in order to make their contracts legal, their salary for the year was $1 whole. So, dollar-a-year man. The Lend-Lease Act, which is a term that many of us are now familiar with, even if we don't realize how familiar we are with it, was approved by Congress in March of 1941 and gave President Roosevelt virtually unlimited authority to direct material aid, such as ammunition, tanks, planes, trucks, and honestly, most importantly, and the one we think of least, food to our allies in Europe, and that would keep us from violating the nation's official position of neutrality. By the end of November of 1941, American industry was operating at record production levels with nearly 25% of all U.S. productive capacity engaged in defense work. And the food is an interesting one because we actually continue that in the post-war period. So when you guys think Lend-Lease, stop thinking guns and tanks, start thinking food, because that's our big breadbasket, right? So December 6, 1941, the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, gives his annual report to the nation and said, quote, "I am proud to report the American people may feel fully confident in their Navy. The fiscal year 1941 witnessed the virtual transition of the nation from a peacetime to a wartime footing with tremendous industrial expansion for production of war material." Now the timing on this, again, looking in hindsight, was very timely because the next day everything would change. We all know December 7th, 1941 is a date which will live in infamy. I have film clips in my other presentation. If you guys want to watch them at the end, we can watch those. But they were by Fox Movietone News cameraman Al Brick, and they're a compelling visual of the attack on Pearl Harbor, showing all of the material losses then. Just before 8 a.m. in the air above Battleship Row, Captain Mitsuoka Fuchida broke radio silence to shout, "Tora, Tora, Tora," tiger, 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 the coded message informing the Japanese fleet that they had caught the Americans by surprise. The attack lasted for 90 minutes, and when it was over, the enemy had sank 5 battleships and damaged 3, sank a gunnery training ship and 3 destroyers, damaged a heavy cruiser, 3 light cruisers, 2 destroyers, 2 seaplane tenders, 2 repair ships, and a destroyer tender. Navy, Army, and Marine Corps facilities suffered varying degrees of damage, while 188 Navy, Marine Corps, and U.S. Army Air Force planes were destroyed. Casualties amounted to killed or missing: Navy, 2,008, Marine Corps, 109, Army, 218, civilian, 68, and wounded, Navy, 710, Marine Corps, 69, Army, 364, civilian, 35. Japanese losses amounted to fewer than 100 men and 29 planes. On December 8, 1941, the U.S. formally declared war on Japan, and in turn, Germany and Italy declared war on us, and we finally had to make the switch from defense production to war production. In an annual budget message given on January 5, 1942, President Roosevelt said, "Powerful enemies must be outfought and outproduced." The War Production Board succeeded the Office of Production Management in January of 1942, and the first chairman of the board was Donald M. Nelson, who served from 1942 to 1944. The National WPB constituted the chair, the secretaries of War, Navy, and Agriculture, and the lieutenant general in charge of War Department procurement, the director of Office of Price Administration, the federal loan administrator, the chair of the Board of Economic Warfare, and the special assistant to the president for the Defense Aid Program. They had advisory, policy making, and progress reporting decisions, but you can tell by who was in it that they had far-reaching effects and they could pretty much control everything. They managed 12 regional offices and operated 120 field offices throughout the nation. They worked alongside state war production boards, which maintained records on state war production facilities, and also helped state businesses obtain war contracts and loans. Their primary task was converting civilian industry to war production. They assigned priorities and allocated scarce materials such as steel, aluminum, and rubber, prohibited non-essential industrial production such as nylons and refrigerators, controlled wages and prices, and mobilized people through patriotic propaganda such as, quote, half the metal in every ship, every tank, every gun is scrap. Throw your scrap into the fight. It initiated events such as scrap metal drives, which were carried out locally to great success. For example, a national scrap metal drive in October of 1942 resulted in an average of almost 82 pounds of scrap per American. The WPB and the nation's factories created a great turnaround. They ensured that each factory received the materials it needed to produce the most war goods in the shortest period of time. But one of the biggest changes was in the workforce itself. In 1940, there were only 13 million women in the total workforce, and by war's end, 21.2 million, which was 40% of the female population of America. It was not all the perfection and glory of Rosie the Riveter saying we can do it that we think of. In addition to fighting sexism in the workplace, 37,000 female workers died in industrial accidents and another 210,000 were permanently disabled. In fact, in the first year of the war, production casualties outpaced combat casualties. From 1942 to 1945, the WPB directed a total production of $185 billion worth of armaments and supplies, nearly $3 trillion today. At war's end, most production restrictions were quickly lifted, and the WPB was abolished on November 3, 1945, with its remaining functions transferred to the Civilian Production Administration. All right, now that I've gotten a lot of alphabet soup out of the way about various boards, let's talk about boats. So the first one I want to talk about is the more alphabet soup, LCPL and LCPR, Landing Craft Personnel Light and Landing Craft Personnel Large and Landing Craft Personnel Ramped. These were the first government contracts received by Matthews in 1941. These boats were originally designed by Andrew Higgins as boats for loggers and trappers in Louisiana. So what worked really, really well in the bayous to transport lumber also worked really well for amphibious warfare. They were also called Eureka boats. And the Landing Craft Personnel Large is kind of what we think of when we think of a landing craft. You know, it has the nice straight bow there, not really pretty, but it didn't have a ramp, which means you had to hop off of it. And the draft of it was tall enough that I look at that and I think about jumping off of it without 60 pounds of gear, and I'm like, well, there goes 2 knees. So the ramp was the improvement because you didn't have to jump out, blow a knee, and then become a casualty. The LCPL was about 36 feet long, its width was a little over 10 feet, and its loaded draft was 3.5 feet. It displaced about 18,000 pounds, but it only needed to be crewed by 3 people. So its capacity of 36 troops meant that your crew was light, but it could actually move a lot of people. Its engine was a gray marine 6-cylinder diesel. Its power was 225 horsepower, and it averaged about 8 knots of speed. And it was armed with 2 30 cal 1919 machine guns, so not overly large defensive guns. It was just enough to provide crossfire while the troops unloaded. These were used by both US and Commonwealth forces, and the early production was part of Lend-Lease. There were total 2,193 of these built, and Matthews was one of 5 contractors. And now we're going to look at some photos. All right, this is the LCPL Large. Notice that there is no ramp, and they are getting ready to jump off the front. For those of you in the back, you'll just have to come up at the end. I don't trust myself to walk around with my laptop that much. This is my favorite photo of the LCPLs in use. And again, I know you guys can't see it. Pretend it's projected up. Come look at it at the end. But the gentleman here, when you look at it, you will see this little white line coming out of his hand. And it is my favorite photo of landing crafts in World War II because of that little white line. So, let me grab my notes. That man is Jack Churchill, and he's leading a training exercise in Inverary, Scotland. And this is one of the early Eureka boats. And Churchill was a British Army officer who fought in World War II armed with a longbow, bagpipes, and that little white line is a Scottish broadsword. He was nicknamed both Fighting Jack Churchill and Mad Jack, which might be a little more accurate. And he was known for the motto, "Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." Now let's talk about the ramp edition, no swords. The LCPR was a little bit longer than the LCPL, same width, same draft, but heavier. Its displacement was 24,100 pounds. Same amount of crew of 3, same capacity of 36 troops, same Gray Marine 6-cylinder diesel, same power of 225 horsepower, but it could go a little bit faster at 9 knots, and same armament of 2 30 cal 1919 machine guns. And the little photo that you'll come up and look at later are Marines coming ashore in the New Georgia Islands circa 1943. There were 2,631 of the LCPRs built, and Matthews was one of 3 contractors in the nation. Now let's jump across the bay and go back to Lyman real quick. Now, Lyman did not receive a contract until May of 1942. They were a little bit later into the game than Matthews. And their first contract was a torpedo plane rearming boat. These were 33-foot flat-bottom boats made out of plywood hulls, and they were used to transport torpedoes, hence the name. Lyman ended up getting 3 contracts for these boats between May of 1942 and January of 1943, and they built about 70 of them. And I've heard an anecdote, can't prove it, but supposedly the first contract they had for this, the very first boat they built, nobody at Lyman believed that marine plywood was a viable building option for boats. They liked their lap straight construction. So they built the first one and immediately sunk it in the harbor and waited for it to delaminate. Well, it didn't. And I kind of have questions as to, there's a war on and that's what you're choosing to do with the first one. But it allowed them to test out marine plywood, so we got there. Lyman's second contract were for Lyman Light Raft Equipment Model 2 Pontoon, Sectional, Plywood. Great Army name, right? I love all the commas. So this long name is actually for a flat-bottomed rectangular plywood boat that were used not so much for moving people, but to be used to build temporary bridges to move people across. These were contracted by Lyman between October and December of 1942. And they built 500 of them. And it was actually these that allowed Lyman to learn how to use an assembly line effectively. And this is what switched Lyman from their pre-war production to their post-war production that most of us in the area are familiar with. The boats were designed to be connected by twos and supported bridge decking, and they could be assembled very, very quickly into a floating bridge for troop movement. And according to Doc Caracni, Tony Giovanelli recalled it was the first time he had seen a line with processes on each boat instead of the previous start one, complete one method at Lyman. And again, when you come up to look, you'll see the nice little bridge there. So our next boat from Lyman is the Lyman Plane Personnel Boat. These were similar to the civilian inboards that Lyman had been producing, and they were used as utility boats by the Navy, primarily for transport of personnel from boat to boat or boat to shore. They had a crew of 2, could fit up to 14 passengers. The engine was a Chrysler Crown, and their speed was 21 knots. There was a Model 1, or Model 2 and Model 4. The Mark II had 35 built by Lyman in 1943, and the Mark IV just says later in the war, and they built 10 of them. Now let's get to my favorite boat, the LCVP, built by Matthews. There we go. All right, so the LCVP was a modification to the LCPR, and it was known by Dwight D. Eisenhower after the war as the boat who won the war, or that won the war. And if Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, landing craft, vehicle, and personnel, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. And as Colonel Joseph H. Alexander, U.S. Marine Corps retired, said, "The Higgins boats broke the gridlock on the ship-to-shore movement. It is impossible to overstate the tactical advantages this craft gave U.S. amphibious commanders in World War II." So this was a 36-foot boat, 11-foot width, draft of 3 feet, so a little bit wider, but not as deep of a draft. Displacement, 18,000 pounds. We've added an additional crew member because of the size of the ramp on this one, so this is a crew of 4. It could still hold 36 troops, and the engine on this one, again, another gray marine diesel, or a Hall Scott gasoline 250 horsepower engine, and its speed was 12 knots. It could also, instead of 36 people, haul a Willys Jeep, a small truck, or other equipment with fewer troops. More than 20,000 of the Higgins-designed landing craft were made from 1942 to 1945, but fewer than 20 remain today, due in part to their method of construction. They were plywood and metal, and as my boaters know, if you don't keep up your marine lumber, that quickly rots away. So fewer than 20 left. So the next photos that when you come up you'll see are of Matthews LCVPs specifically. Lyman also aided with some of the components of LCVPs like transoms, bow, and deck assemblies, but they didn't have full contracts. Lyman manufactured these parts under contract number 2046. Matthews boat manufactured under contract 2046 is being shown hoisted at the factory in August of 1943 there. The ramp designs varied. That one shows an X-brace reinforcement with 2 vertical ribs and a horizontal angle iron. The other one shows the diamond-shaped reinforcement, and that one is loaded on a transport truck in July of 1945. And I believe Bob has a good anecdote about the switch in transportation from horses to trucks during World War II. I said, I thought you had a good story about the switch from horses to trucks during World War II? And how you move boats?
Well, I was too young to work there. I did have an opportunity to take a short ride in one when they took it out for test. And they took it out and right down by the yacht club, the channel goes into the yacht club, and then of course the river goes on and out. But that point of land was owned by the lighthouse, the government, and it was kind of a sandy thing, and they would test that ramp run up on that sandbar and make sure it worked and all of that.
So for those of you who may not have heard Bob, what he said was he remembers going on a ride in one of the Higgins as they were being tested, and it was the yacht club at the mouth of the Portage River, and they test the ramp there. So I feel bad talking about the history that he lived through when we have such an expert here, but if you'll bear with me, I'll keep going a little bit more. I also have some photos from August of 1945 showing the boats in the water in the Portage River. And I love talking about Matthews LCVPs, not just because the Higgins boats have such a great history and a great renown, again, the boat that won the war, but they also made it to each of the big theaters of operation, the Mediterranean Theater, the Pacific Theater, and the European Theater. And I do have some local news articles I'll read out to you guys real quick. So the first D-Day of D-Days that we talk about was not Normandy, it was Sicily, frequently in studying World War II. And Matthews co-landing boats praised by Navy. Craft played big role in amphibious landing on Sicily. The landing boats, which are built at Matthews Boat Company, part of Fort Clinton, played a major part in the brilliant landing of the U.S. Armed Forces on Sicily last month, the landing which was a prelude to the ultimate capitulation of the Mediterranean island. This was the compliment which was received at the local company officers from the Navy Department this week in a telegram. The telegram received reads as follows, quote, "The Matthews Company, you'll be glad to know that LCVPs of your construction were part of the spearhead in the successful invasion of Sicily. The fact that the landing operations on a scale unparalleled in history were effected with a maximum of precision and a minimum of casualties was in no small measure due to the excellence of these specialized assault craft, such as you are providing for our amphibious forces. We shall need many more vehicle and personnel landing craft for the big job still ahead, the establishment of bridgeheads leading direct to Berlin and Tokyo. We are confident you will do your utmost to provide them on time. Signed, E.L. Cochran, Rear Admiral, U.S. Navy, Chief of Bureau of Ships." So a pretty good response after that first amphibious landing. And then my second article I have is actually my favorite. The thrill of a lifetime came to a Port Clinton man serving with Uncle Sam's forces in the Pacific area last month. It was revealed yesterday to Mr. and Mrs. John J. Nissen in a letter from their son, Ensign J. Frederick Nissen of the U.S. Naval Reserves. Nissen, who during his high school days was employed in the Herald plant and who won the State Prince of Peace Declaration contest before entering the Navy, wrote 2 long letters to his parents dated January 8th. In one, he said in part that, quote, "We have a beach boat here that was made right there at the Matthews Boat Works. It has a brass plate on it saying that it was made by the Matthews Company at Port Clinton, Ohio. That boat is my pride and joy, as you can well imagine." And then finally, the big D-Day, the one that everybody thinks of. Carl Matthews, Vice President and Acting General Manager of the Matthews Boat Co., which has been turning out the invasion barges playing an important part in the D-Day landing, said, quote, "Naturally, word of the invasion has been of special interest here. We know that the equipment that we've been working on for the last year and a half is now in intensive use. I could tell walking through the plant this morning, Tuesday, how proud the men are, and believe me, they are all working harder than ever." So Lyman also had some other boats that were not produced in very large quantities, and I don't have a lot of information on them, but they also had 70-foot line handling boats, 16-foot storm boats, and 36-foot harbor patrol boats. The harbor patrol boats were used almost exclusively by the Royal Navy, and the storm boats were smaller assault boats, and they used a 50-horsepower Evinrude storm boat motor. And the best photos of these are actually in Evinrude ads from the war saying, you know, once the war's over and you can actually buy stuff again, come buy an Evinrude, because look what we're doing for the war. And we've talked a lot about Lyman and Matthews, but let's talk about related production. Other companies in the area obviously contributed to war production in many, many ways, but we do have 2 other examples that tie directly back to our maritime service. And the Sandusky Library has in their collections a document from the Klotz Machine Company and from Union Chain. In addition, for a wide range of material intended for use in naval vessels, Klotz Machine specifically notes bronze casting for Eureka boats, possibly the very LCPLs being made by Matthews. And Union Chain makes notes of ramp chains, so at that point it's the LCPRs or the LCVPs. And I want to end with a quote from Donald Nelson, the chairman of the War Production Board. "This is the record. For 9 years before Pearl Harbor, Germany, Italy, and Japan prepared themselves intensively for war, while as late as 1940, the war production of peaceful America was virtually nothing. Yet 2 years later, the output of our war factories equaled that of the Axis nations combined, was actually exceeding that. In 1943, our war production was 1.5 times as much, and in 1944, more than double Axis production, a remarkable demonstration of power." All right, at this point, I'd like to open up for questions, or if you guys want to come up and look at images. Yes?
Just curious, they assembled these boats here at Matthews. Did the actual materials come from? Were they also locally made?
As far as I know, the materials used for the LCVPs were locally made. So the ramps and things like that were Lyman. I haven't been able to find the specific contract numbers to say like the Union Chains were definitely this, but looking at how much we were limiting use of gasoline and rubber for tires, why would we produce it here and then send it to California if we have a production here? So most of it seems to be pretty local, and that seems to be kind of across the board if you look at wartime production. We weren't making small pieces like on the eastern seaboard and then shipping them west. It stayed as local as possible.
Approximately how long did it take them to build one boat?
All right, I do not have strict for that one in relation to wartime production, but I can answer that for Lyman both pre-war and post-war. So pre-war, Lyman made 500 boats in the highest year in the 1930s, and they were turning out a boat like every 2 weeks or so. Post-war, they had it down to every 7 hours they had an outboard. I'm sorry, every 35 minutes was an outboard, every 7 hours was an inboard. And their peak year in 1955 was almost 6,000 boats. It was over 5,000. there's a great book by Doc Karakni that has the specific numbers. I also have it in a different document, but ballparking. So that switch that Tony Giovanelli talked about, like watching the assembly line and making multiple boats at once, really made a big difference for linemen. I don't have answers for how long it took to make a landing craft, but they were bigger and slightly more convoluted than a torpedo boat or one of the pontoons. So I don't know, Bob, you remember? Sorry to put you on the spot on that one. Yes?
Yep. Since there was so much with the LSTs and that with the slower engines, why did Lyman and Matthews be given contracts for smaller, slower boats instead of faster PP boats when they had that capability in the 20s and 30s of faster yachts?
I don't know. I won't even hazard a guess on that one. I'm not, and it's hard to find good information. I need to just go down to the National Archives and spend a week down there and do research. But online, it's hard to find good information justification as to why certain companies got contracts. Like, why did Lyman not get a contract for another year after Matthews got their first one? I have some ideas, but nothing hard, tangible that I can prove. Yes?
Women work at either one of those boats?
I also haven't gotten proof on that. If they did, any knowledge of women working in production at Matthews during the war?
Not that I'm aware of, certainly in the office.
Okay, so in the office, but no information. If I can step away from maritime production, also in the area, so Camp Perry had Erie Ordnance during the war, and they had a lot of women working there, but it was for Army ordnance, not Navy ordnance. I was even double checking to see if they did anything for naval guns, but it was all Army. But they did larger things. They had 24 millimeter howitzer rounds that were produced there, so they were doing some large guns, not just small ammo. But that would be the closest and the biggest confirmed women in military production that I have. And they call them WOWs, Women Ordnance Workers. And there's a really cool scanned copy of one of the company newsletters from July of 1943 in the Ohio Memory Project. And it even talks about picking one of the WOWs is going to be the pinup for the week. And here you go, GIs. Here's a real American woman, and she's posing all nice and cute. And then in my personal collection, I have some paperwork belonging to a woman who worked at Erie Ordnance and had to get special dispensation to leave her job because it was such an essential job. She had an essential war job. So she had to get permission from her boss to enlist in the Army. And he wrote it, and she enlisted in May of '45, so got in at the very end of the war. But I thought it was interesting that to join the Army, you had to get permission. Not a hand raised, just a hand move. Any other questions? Yes?
World War II obviously was wooden landing craft. When did they switch over to the current day landing craft that I wanted?
So I don't search for current day, but I do have an LCVP related answer. So shortly after Korea was the switch from the plywood hulled LCVPs to the fiberglass hulled LCVPs. So if you guys see an LCVP out on Lake Erie, in August there's an event in Conneaut and they use landing craft there. Spoiler alert, those are all post-war landing craft, they're not World War II. But close enough. But those are all fiberglass and they're later war production. And there's many more of those have survived just by nature of what they're made out of.
I've always been under the impression that Cantankerous from Putin Bay originally a landing craft. Do you know that vessel at all?
I do not.
That's steel, that's not glass. It's been around for a while.
Well, and it could be maybe not an LCVP, but one of the other landing crafts that I'm less familiar with. Okay, this is where I have to give my true thing. Even though I'm working on a master's in World War II studies, my real focus is gender studies within the military. So I look more at like how women join the military, not so much material. Yes.
With the question about why smaller boats were made here and not the bigger ones, would that relate any possibly to just transportation and bigger vessels were built?
It could. I would have problems with that one, though, looking at what we were doing in the 19th century and how connected we were to rail lines and how easy it was for us to move larger, heavier things by rail. I mean, if you or even just not other vessels, but how heavy the ice was we were moving. So again, like I need to do a deeper dive. I just need to go to National Archives for a week and dig. Everybody's idea of a vacation, right? Yes.
Assuming Matthews then shipped them out by rail?
Truck and then rail.
Molly, with regard to your research, any research on Matthews or Lyman boats that were confiscated by the U.S., these would be private yachts confiscated by the U.S. and converted to military purposes?
That is a great question. I have not found any of that in my research, so it could just be a gap that I haven't done, but thank you for the good question and giving me a new rabbit hole. I'm getting a copy of this, right, so I can remember all the stuff I'm going to research later? Okay. All right. If there's no other questions, you guys want to come up and see the photos you couldn't see? Thank you.